most of the research on attention is visual attention because we tend to think that vision is our most important sense. It's probably also the most practical, technically practical sense to manipulate, to test. But most of the higher order, the macro theoretical theories about vision, they are relevant for other senses, mainly hearing as well. All right. Now, research on attention, and that's probably relevant for any field, goes like this. There are those that try to define, to anchor, to understand the basic definitions of the mechanisms of visual attention. How it works, what are the processes, those are the big theories. Then this is, let's say, the inner circle of the field of visual attention. Then the second circle would be all those researchers, all those subfields of attention that use the most basic definitions and paradigms and effects, and they use either to better define things within the field or to discover new things. Let's say exogenous attention, endogenous attention, or manipulations of covered and overt attention shift. They tend to ask whether those basic principles, how they interact with perception and other processes around the field. So that would be the second. And then the biggest field, the largest circle, would be those that assume everything that the field of attention, the theories, the accepted, the canonical theories of attention propose, and they use it for other things. So in social psychology, in emotion, everything you can imagine, they use this myriad of different fields. They use manipulations and theories and hypotheses from the field of attention. They assume it as is, and then they check whatever they want to check from another field. Okay. The chunk, the inner, what I call the inner circle goes like this. During probably from the 50s until the 90s, there was a big discussion about the basic processes of attention. Things were more or less agreed upon, and since then we have been assuming, we have been adopting the theories from the 19th on. The biggest theory in the field nowadays, in the last 20 years, maybe more, probably the theory that has the largest number of papers that involves is the perceptual load theory, which was proposed in the 90s and has been used for everything outside attention. If you ask researchers inattention, in the field of attention, those in the inner circle, nobody likes this theory. Nobody agrees, nobody accepts this theory. On the other hand, the psychology, all the fields in psychology use it. Okay, we'll get there. So that's the main focus of our lecture today. Attention, probably the biggest inner definition, theoretical definition of attention as a function, uses the word selection. How do we select the information that is pertinent and don't spend resources on what is impertinent? There are huge problems with that definition. What is pertinent, what is relevant, what is irrelevant. So many times, the definition of relevant is a hindsight definition. Like when we see what was used, we say, this was the relevant information. And at least half of the times, there is no theoretical criterion to decide up front what is relevant and what is not. But still, it's accepted that attention is a function that tries to select information from what must be used, or etc. So and the word filter is everywhere. We talked about the main paradigms, the Stroop, the flanker, global local, and Simon. Stroop and flanker are the biggest ones. And all these paradigms, effects, and theoretical interpretations, they adopt partially or fully the response competition hypothesis, which is motor by definition. Within the field, what I said before, from the 50s to the 90s, the debate between early and late selection debate, the main story is when it happens, when the filter is employed, when during the process, from the moment that stimuli enters until the moment that there is a response, when the filter, the selection takes place, makes its things, whether early or late. We'll come back to this soon. One important note, all those classic definitions from the book, not only from the book, regarding overt attention, covert attention, exogenous and endogenous attention, they are irrelevant. All of those regard attentional shift, when you move the focus of attention from one place to the other. So overt would be when you move your eyes, when you put your fovea wherever the focus of attention is. Covert is without moving your eyes. Exogenous is when stimuli predict the shift of the attention. There is a big problem with the definition of what is exogenous attention. I hope I'll get to this. And endogenous would be when the system decides. It can be consciously. I decide while I am looking here, I'm paying attention to this side. Or unconsciously, a prime or a stimulus sends my attention, my focus of attention somewhere else. So let's review the flanker task. So we have two alternative targets in the center of the screen, flanked by two distractors. Incongruent distractors are those that incongruent displays, trials, are those in which the distractor is the alternative target. The identity of the distractors, they are associated with the wrong motor response. And what we always see, it's a very strong effect, that reaction time for incongruent displays is slower than for neutral displays. This is the interference part, if you remember. Usually we don't see facilitation effects in the flanker task. Facilitation is between congruent displays and neutral displays when the distractors and the target have the same identity. The other part of the flanker interference effect, one is reaction time, the other is accuracy. So we have more errors for incongruent displays than for neutral displays. So the common assumption, the common interpretation is that our attentional system, which is guided by spatial discriminations in the case of a flanker task, that is, the attentional system is supposed to choose to select only the targeted location and to suppress or to avoid processing the distractor's locations. But even though trial after trial, and we are talking about 300, 400, 500 trials in one session, 1 hour, the participant is looking, trial after trial. Takes between 1 second, 1.5 seconds between trials. Tick, 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 tick. And every trial looks the same. The target appears in the center of the screen and the distractor, even though all these optimal configuration circumstances, it is assumed that our spatial selection mechanism apparatuses are unable to do it efficiently. So many alternative explanations for this failure, maybe because the area of a traditional flanker task, the area of all the stimuli is too small. So if our attentional visual system works like a spotlight and it can focus in the area of interest, it cannot focus, it cannot concentrate the focus in a smaller area than more or less 3 degrees. Or maybe because every time we see 3 things like that, even though they are not meaningful letters, we still have this automatic tendency to chunk them together as if it was a word, gestalt-wise instincts, or because during the time that we are trying to identify the target, our system cannot concentrate for this long. It's like, I don't know, 400 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds, less, but it's long enough for the system to let resources slip away from the targeted area or leak. It's more or less the same. These are minor differences in the models. So we have spatial selection failure, which is equal for all displays, which means that the information from the distractors, the information accumulated from the distractors, is the same. It doesn't matter which distractor was presented, right? And the target the same. So the system, because it fails or it doesn't, the system accumulates information from all the displays in the same way, at least in the first part, or no, during the entire process. They accumulate because the system cannot suppress the distractor positions, so the accumulation of the information is identical. And the time course of this accumulation should be identical too. So the assumption, the conclusion, the assumption of all the different theories for the last 50, 60 years is that our system cannot, for some structural reason, filter out distractors when all the stimuli are presented in a very small area. So usually it's accepted that when the area is smaller than 3 degrees of visual field, the system cannot pry into it and select only one part and disregard another part. The second assumption, adopted interpretation, is that the difference in time and in accuracy between the incongruent and congruent and neutral displays is a result of post-perceptual processes. So, according to the response competition hypothesis, as I said, that is an umbrella explanation for all those paradigms, all those effects. In incongruent displays, we have the incongruent, the congruent, the target identity activates the entire system until it activates the correct motor response, and the incongruent distractors, because their identity is part of the response set, the target set, they activate at the same time the incorrect motor response. In neutral displays, the neutral distractors, they are processed exactly. Those guys were processed incongruent, but they do not activate any motor response. So there is no competition. And the assumption is that once there is a competition, two hands are activated at the same time, a higher level decision-making system entity has to decide which hand will be allowed to press the button, and this consumes additional processing time, and that is the flanker effect. Now, we already know that the problem is that we only have RT, we only have 2 points to connect. We have the stimuli we presented to our participants, and we have reaction time and accuracy collected. We don't have anything in the middle. How do we know that this is a result of here, but not something that happened here? So I told you that during the 80s, 90s, there was a big series of researchers from different people, very, very respected researchers in the field, including Erik Erikson, which is the original, the first author, the person that invented the flanker paradigm. And the flanker paradigm, meaning including the manipulations, the interpretations, the methodology, the analysis. By the way, the first most important pair was Erikson and Erikson 74. It was Erik Erikson and Barbara Erikson. They were a couple. They passed away already. So there was a big chunk of of important papers, researchers, of important people that they used electrophysiological measurements independent of one another, each one in itself problematic because the electrophysiological measurements are indirect. We measure electricity, we measure waves in the brain that we assume. We have a chain of assumptions, methodological assumptions for each one of them. that we assume that it reflects something that we want. But when we use many together, even though each one of them is not strong as RT and accuracy, which are direct behavioral measurements, which are agreed upon, everybody agrees what RT reflects more or less. It reflects a delay, reflects interference, it reflects a problem. P300? P300 is ERP, is like EEG, electroencephalogram. So it's that cap with all the electrodes in the brain. And during the time that the participant is answering, many things are happening in the brain. Endless different waves, different frequencies are happening at the same time outside the task all the time. Our brain doesn't stop for a minute, we know that. But after many hundreds, thousands even of experiments and convergent research, the field agrees that the P100, which is a peak in a specific frequency, a peak wave in a specific frequency that happens in the brain after 300 milliseconds, that's why P100, we have N negative when it goes down and P when it goes up. It's the opposite, but doesn't matter. 300 is the time in milliseconds after the stimulus was. So every time that something, well, we know P100, okay, LRP, it's another one, it's a preparation of a response that happens afterward, and EMG is the best one, is electromyogram. It's an electrode on every muscle, and it can see when the muscle starts to activate, even much before movement. So if it moves, you really can see it, but even a preparation, when even before the participant can feel or realize or even think about any movement, the muscles are already preparing, and we see it on EMG. All these measurements have an extremely high resolution in time. They are very good because we can pry into microseconds even, which we don't need for research in perception and cognition. We usually work in the area of milliseconds. Seconds are already too slow. fMRI, this is one of the problems with fMRI, with magnets, is that they assess processes, the both reaction in the blood, oxygen, doesn't matter, but the time resolution is very slow for perceptual or cognitive processes. Okay, so they tested they used independent measurements to check whether what we think that we know about the P100, the LRP, and the EMG, they are congruent. They make sense in terms of the response competition hypothesis, the theoretical story that they offered. If so, we should see a correlation between the competition that a certain display elicited, a competition between two alternative simultaneously activated responses, and the RT delay. And this can be checked trial by trial. So maybe one incongruent display, one trial out of 300 trials for one participant, one trial can already tell us, which means that if we can check trial by trial, we can have a very strong statistical power for these measurements, for these assessments. If we see in one specific a correlation trial by trial between the activation of the wrong response and the amount of delay, then it gives us a strong, it doesn't prove anything, obviously. It can be many other things, but at least it doesn't rule out that possibility. If they haven't seen this correlation, we would have to rule out the response competition hypothesis. So they observed strong correlations between the activations of the wrong response and the amount of time that took until the factor response was made. Okay. Do you understand why this doesn't prove? It only supports. And the only possibility, the only final, the only conclusive result would be if they couldn't find it, or if they found a negative correlation that we would rule out, but it doesn't prove. Okay. Since then, the response the hypothesis, because, and now it's the sociology of science, which today is staring, because these were very important people and very important because they best researchers, strong researchers, beautiful papers, very well written. Because there was this wave, since then nobody checked the response competition hypothesis for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. It became very few. We won't have time, but never mind. It's accepted that this is an umbrella explanation for all these paradigms and effects in the field of attention. What remains is the question why the system, the attentional filter, the attentional mechanisms cannot visually select the target and suppress or not process the distractors in a typical flanker task. Why we have visual a failure of visual selection. All right, early selection theories. So as I told you, between the 50s and the 90s, early selectionists against late selectionists. Early selection, the big assumption is that we have limited perceptual resources. What does it mean, limited? It must involve time. So we have unlimited resources. If you are given unlimited time, you can process and perceive anything in your visual field. But given a short period of time, the presentation, the immediate presentation of the stimuli in the flanker task, the resources you immediately have to identify the target, they are crude, they're coarse. So in order for the system, that's the early selection main story, in order for the system to be able to identify the identity of a stimulus, whether it's an X or a Z or which one of the alternative targets from the target set, the system has to draft all the available resources, which are limited, concentrate them upon the target, and only then the system can identify it, either because it needs more resolution or because the system needs to start comparing the stimulus presented at the moment to memory, to the stored set of alternative targets. So many inner mechanisms have been proposed. Probably the most important name would be Donald Broadbent, who wrote so much in the field. You recognized Danny Kahneman, who, by the way, taught my PhD supervisor. So in academic lingo, Danny Kahneman is my grandfather. Anne Treisman was his wife. She passed away. Kahneman and Tversky, they got the Nobel Prize for Economy. Never mind. So early selection theory. So many inner mechanisms were suggested. Either we do pigeonholing, meaning that we cover things that we don't need, and we let only the important information enter the system, or categorizing, chunking them feature-wise, identity semantically wise, or location-wise. And only then, after the filter stepped in and did and concentrated the resources, we can continue to identify and then reach the right decision for the response. Why two corollary explanations would be leakage and slippage, meaning that if the filter is a colander, let's say, so the holes are too big, so the distractors they pass through the filter, that would be leakage. The system doesn't have the resolution for this kind of stimuli. Slippage would be that the resources that the attentional system concentrated on that area, the time that takes to process everything, they slip, they fall, and whatever is close by the target, the slipped resources end up processing. So all of those are failures of the system. So area, okay, so one of the metaphors used during many years, is still used, it has problems, is that our attentional focus is like a spotlight. We can open it and disperse the resources, and as early selection suggests, we can focus it in a very small concentrated beam of light with where we have more power, more processing power. Okay. Leakage and slippage, they are more or less the same, and chunking would be like it's a Gestalt based idea that we are so used to read words that we cannot parse out most participants. They are people that read a lot. So whenever they see three letters, even if they have no semantic meaning, they cannot parse out, they cannot see three objects, they automatically see one object if they are close together. Even if it's not letters, we chunk together. All right. Late selection assumes that our perceptual capacity, our perceptual resources, they are not that critically limited. And we can perceive, we can collect high resolution information from everything that appears. And attentional mechanisms, they operate much later, after we already collected inside our system. We don't have to continue to accumulate together to collect information inside our system. Within it connects with memory entities, and only then attentional mechanisms decide, filter the important, the pertinent information in order to reach the correct response. Which means that as long as the stimuli are presented, the system continues to gather information, high resolution information. I'll jump, we don't have time. Contingent capture theory is an important one from the late 90s, from Tevis, from Holland. The main idea of the contingent capture is that the distractor, the target set, influences, directs our perceptual system, meaning that if we are looking for, if the two targets in the task is X and Y, the basic perceptual process are already attuned to Xness and Y-ness. So anything that looks like an X will be prioritized. The perceptual thing will process more of those, of anything that resembles an X and a Y on the account of other stimuli. So this is heavily memory induced, determined. So let's say that here in this specific manipulation of the flanker task, the two targets are either this slanted line or this slanted line, right? This or this. So those lines here, they are part of the target, of the prioritized family of things, or of stimuli. So they are processed much more than curved lines, which are not. So if we had a neutral distractor that resembles this, they would also be more processed and would probably interfere with responses much more. One manipulation, for instance, is that if the targets would be like randomly either red or blue, if one of those neutral distractors appear in red or blue, they will also be processed more than if they appear on black. Perceptual load theory. It began, it was suggested, it was proposed in 1995 by Nili Lavi, also from Tel Aviv University. She, after her PhD, she became a professor in the City College of London. I think so, yeah. And she's one of the biggest names in the field of attention, of visual attention, for sure. And let me just show you. Look, if you put Nili Lavi on Google Scholar, her first paper, the original paper, has 2,381 citations. for in the field of attention, that's a lot. That's really a lot. That's crazy numbers. From 2005, this is a famous one. Also, trends. It's an important paper. This is a superficial, not in a bad way, a review of all the perceptual load ideas and evidence. Yet, if you ask researchers in the field, everybody, all of them will say, no, yeah, no, nobody, I don't know if accepts is the right word, but so it's mainly used, all those all those citations are people in different fields using the perceptual load theory as an assumption. And why? Because it's elegant, it's nice, it's a very good narrative, it's a good story. And let's see how much time we have today. If not, I'll continue next time. I want you to understand what are the problems with this narrative. Okay, so the perceptual load theory is a hybrid theory between early and late selection. It starts, think about it, after 30 years of the big guns fighting. No, it's early selection, it's late selection. So early selection, so much evidence based on it. The fact that we can only hear, if dichotic listening, you give two messages, each one in one ear. This was probably the first important base of evidence. If you give only two separate information, each one in one ear, you can only process one of them. Late selection, the cocktail party effect. You are listening to the conversation with the three people around you, a lot of noise around, and you're really concentrated and you're following and you participate in a conversation in front of you, in a conversation behind you that you even didn't know it's been conducted. Suddenly someone says your name, you jump. You don't know, you don't know what they were talking about, but suddenly your name, and then you jump, meaning that something behind your consciousness, something behind the system has been listening to all the conversations around. And once your name jumped, this system captured, stopped you, moved your head. Okay, so this would be late selection. So the perceptual load theory came and said, no, there exist both early and late selection. They both can occur. Our system is not either. And what determines whether it will be, if the information will be filtered early or late, is the demands of the task. If we have a difficult task, then the task itself will use all, I'm talking about this part here, will use all the available resources. And there will remain no spare unused resources. If the task is very easy, then there will be processing resources, perceptual, I don't know, resources that will remain unused. And those resources, they walk around and they start processing whatever they find on the way, and then you end up processing things that you don't need. So when you have a demanding task, you end up, the system ends up applying early selection. And when it's an easy task, it's late selection. The assumption here, let's say the cocktail party effect, the assumption is that to follow a conversation in a noisy place, in a cocktail party, you don't need too many resources. So according to the perceptual load theory, the cocktail party effect occurs because you have resources unused and they have nothing to do. They start to listen to the other conversation. Sorry for I'm making half of a joke of that. It's not out of disrespect for Neely, but it's funny. Because the assumption is that for every task, we have a minimal amount of resources that we must exhaust, that we have to burn. We cannot not use this minimal amount of resources. That's a problem. That's a problem. Now, this critical assumption, what I just said, is not written anywhere. Is not written in none of the perceptual load theory mess. It's a logical derivation of the perceptual load theory. Because, okay, you know what? Let's go back to, let me explain exactly how yes, it's she, it's Neely, mainly these first papers, how it was operationalized. So easy tasks, as I just said.
My stomach hurts, so no, but I can't take this to buy it. Actually, I'm gonna give these to homeless.
Maya. Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Easy tasks. So easy tasks are, in the terminology of the perceptual load theory, is low load. So the task demands not too much. It imposes a low processing load on the participant. And difficult tasks, they impose a high perceptual cognitive load. Ooh, it gets complicated because, okay, I'll stop. We want later on, people started to find problems in replicating those experiments, and they found holes in the system, and then the problem began because the perceptual theory started to patch holes and problems, and suddenly load had to be separated in cognitive load, memory load, perceptual load, and that the original is perceptual load. But then cognitive load is the opposite of perceptual load, and memory load is also the opposite. So in the end, it became like a Frankenstein. Sorry, again, I'm saying without disrespect. The way I'm describing is on behalf of all of those that have criticism about it, which includes me. That suddenly it became a Frankenstein of anything, any effect that doesn't really work with the original perceptual load narrative can be explained by changing the adjective of the load. And then at a certain moment, after 10, 15 years, researchers in the field started to feeling uncomfortable, and to Neely explained that perceptual load, the load that the task imposes, plays a causal role. It's the main thing. That's the thing that determines whether it will be early selection or late selection. This is a quotation for 95. This is a very compromising and very courageous and very firm assertion. The proposal that a theoretical suggested entity or mechanisms plays a causal role. Well, you seldom see it written. Researchers, scientists are usually a little bit more careful to use such a strong word. But she did. She is a very strong person. And the main prediction is that we will always see a negative correlation between the load imposed, measured, operationalized, reflected by reaction time and accuracy, and selection efficiency. Selection efficiency is a derivation of reaction time, right? It's the difference in reaction time between the conditions. And the hypothesis is that distractors are processed in the low load in terms of the temporal locus of attention operation, early or late, that that the load will define, meaning that the distractors are processed only after the target has been processed, because they are processed only in the low load condition, and they are processed by surpluses. Surpluses can only exist after the main part was used, right? So those resources that processed the distractor, they became available only after the target was processed. So distractors were processed after the target was processed and identified. And identified, why? Because only after target identification there is surplus. Otherwise, if it was only localization of the target, like early selection would say, that in order to identify we need more resources, then the system would continue to invest the resources in the target. There would be no surplus, or the surplus can only occur after target identification, right? It's obvious, I'm repeating myself.
I actually have a question. I'm not sure I understand really why we must like exhaust like all the processing resources, like if there's not a lot in the critical assumption. Like for example, like with distraction, and like in the textbook when they were talking about distraction, here you kind of choose to like not process like everything. So how come with here in critical assumption, like you don't have like cognitive choice? You just like, you don't even realize and you have to process more information?
Well, probably all the important names in the field of attention would jump in joy by your question. That's the problem. Where does it come from? How can it be? First of all, where does it come from? Minimum amount of resources? How can we define it? Is it per time? Is it per task? That's what's the suggestion. It cannot be per time because actually it determines time, determines reaction. So it's per task. How can we anchor that on anyone? And where does it doesn't, it's not connected to any other idea, any other even intuition. Look, your intuition jumped exactly in the right place. What does it mean, minimum amount, and why it must be exhausted? How can we operationalize this idea? How can we even check that hypothesis. This is one, I think this is the biggest theoretical problem with the perceptual load theory. Okay, so let me show how, and this is the first work was, it's not surprising that it was so well accepted. It's very elegant, it's very convincing. Look what she did. The prediction is that a negative correlation between load, so the more difficult the task is, the better the selection. Let me say it again. The more difficult the task is, the more the higher the load, the less the distractors will be processed, which results in less differences between neutral and incongruent displays, right? I'll explain it soon again. So this is the first and most famous manipulation. So these are low load displays. These are easy trials. The target is the letter that appears somewhere along the center row, and the distractor appears randomly in one of the 4 positions around the target, up, left, up, right, down. Okay, and it's low load because you have only one letter to find, and you identified it really fast, and then with these surpluses you end up processing the distractors, and then because we end up processing the distractors in incongruent trials, the incongruent distractors that were processed, they compete with the target, and then we have response competition. Then we have slower reaction times compared to neutral, where the neutral distractors were also processed in low load displays, but they didn't activate any motor response, so no response competition. In the high load displays, high load condition, because the target, the same 2 alternative targets, X or Z, but the target is embedded in a string of letters. So the participant has to find the letter among the string, which is more difficult, and according to the perceptual load theory, it consummates all the available processing resources, and then we end up not processing the distractors. So in all those displays, according to the perceptual load theory, we don't process the distractors, and that's why, and then there is no response competition for either incongruent displays or neutral displays, and that's why there is no difference in reaction time between incongruent and neutral in high load trials, and there is in low load trials where the distractor response. This is important. So low load displays, inefficient selection, we end up processing the distractor, and that's why there is distractor interference, which is the difference between incongruent and neutral. In high load displays, because all the resources were used, the selection is efficient and distractors were not processed, and that's why there is no difference between this and this, even though all those trials, they take much longer to answer, to react, than all those trials. The incongruent trials in low load displays, they are faster all in all than the neutral trials in the high load displays. Okay? So the efficient selection, the no interference, is the difference between this and this. Okay? So here we have equivalent RTs, here we have slower for incongruent and for neutral, even though all those trials are faster to respond than all those trials. This is from her original paper. These are and nowadays it doesn't happen anymore. Although there is no problem, but there is no picture. There are only tables. There is no graph, I mean. So here what we see, the important part is this. So this is the task load, low condition, high condition. This is reaction time, the mean reaction time. And this is the difference between incongruent and neutral. And we can see that the difference in milliseconds between the incongruent and the neutral, that is the interference in the low condition, which is this, is 40 milliseconds, which is highly significant. And in the high condition, the difference between incongruent and neutral is 4 milliseconds, which is statistically insignificant. This is another very famous, let me just say something, the perceptual load effect is extremely strong, very reliable. You can do endless manipulations, it will always work. That's why it became so famous and so used and so prominent in the field of attention, because it works every time. And the narrative, as I told you before, is communicative, is elegant. Oh, we have, but nobody is wrong. You have been fighting for 50 years. Nobody, you are right and you are right. It depends on the circumstances. So everybody liked it. So this is another alternative manipulation. So here we have the target is again either an X or a Z. And the target appears within this circle. So low load is when the circle is made of O's or zeros. So it's easy to find the target among this thing. And according to perceptual load theory, the unused resources end up processing the distractor, which are these guys that appear in either side of the circle. In high load, again, we have different ladders, so it takes longer, it's more difficult to find the target. And then according to the perceptual load, we don't process those guys. So these are low load displays. So first of all, the first story, the first problem, the first hole with all the manipulations of the perceptual load theory is that the different conditions, the different displays were presented in separate blocks of trials. So participants responded to, let's say they sat for 1 hour, they responded to 200 trials of low load displays, one after another, and then they rested for 2 minutes, and then 200 trials of only high load displays, they rested, and then again 200 trials of only low load, and then only high load, instead of putting together everything randomly and high load together. It was blocked, separated. This is a big problem. So this would be, imagine 200 trials in a row that you see displays like that you have to find these guys. You can see, I put this darker side so you can see the objects that appear. So you're this tick, 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 tick. Okay, so this is a block, 200, it takes like 10 minutes, one after the other. And then for high load displays, you have these two objects. The target is somewhere here inside. And then tick, tick, tick. So the fact that they were blocked, and there is this different, in much before you recognize any letter, there is this difference in objects. The participant is already learning something. You already have a strategy that has nothing to do with processing resources. So in high load, blocks of 200 trials, one trial after the other with high-low displays, the participants learned very fast to find the target within the big object and ignore the small object. So even though it took a long time to find the target within the big object, they didn't even, the system didn't pay attention, didn't process the small object, which is the distractor. Because every trial there was a big object and a small object, and the target was always inside the big object. Now, in low displays, there were two objects of the same size. And they appeared between trials in slightly different places. So the target was always in the central row, but the distractor was in one of the 4 positions around it. So it's a little bit confusing which, when every new display of low load appeared, inside, again, I remind you, an entire block of only low displays. So whenever the display appeared, it took a moment to understand which one of the 2 identical objects was the target and which one was the distractor. So in many of these trials, the participant mistakenly started processing the distractor before it realized it's not the target. So in average, even though all those trials resulted in much faster reaction times, in many of them the identity of the distractor was processed, and that interfered with the response to the target when the distractors were incongruent. Which means that if we have in low displays the distractor as a different object from the target, then the participants would be able to go directly to the small object, which is the target. And the target again is alone, which is a low load, right? It's very easy to identify. And by the same token, on the opposite side, if in high-low displays we have the exact same target embedded within a string of letters, but now the distractor is an object of the same size, then the participants wouldn't be able to discern between the irrelevant object, the distractor, and the targeted object, the string of letters within which the target is embedded. Or at least they wouldn't be able to immediately discern. So this is exactly an experiment that I myself ran. I usually don't like to show my work when I teach because there are much more important things, but in this case it's very relevant. So what we did is, this is a replication of low load, exactly like the original perceptual load experiments. And as you know, in every experiment you have to replicate the original effect, because God knows you want to know if the effect exists for your participants, with your computer, with your experimenter, your instructions, whatever it is. So this is the replication. And then what we did is that we made the distractor discernible from the target. So here it was in a different color. Here it was a big object of only distractors. Here the distractor was huge, and here it appeared at the same, along an entire block, the same relative position to the target. So in this example here, always on the bottom right in relation to the target. According to the perceptual load theory, identifying the target in all those conditions would be identical and easy, meaning low load. So for all those conditions, after identifying the target, there would be surpluses of resources that would go and process the distractors. Even more for this condition where the distractor should pop out. It's larger. It should attract attention, and another color the same. So this is what we got. This is the replication, exactly like the original perceptual load experiments. A 33 milliseconds difference between the neutral displays and the incongruent displays. But here, not only all these conditions were faster in average than the replication of the low load, so all of this should be even lower load, which means that should be even more surplus of resources walking around and undesirably processing the distractor, even though in these cases the distractor interference, the difference between the neutral and congruent, was much smaller. And these guys, I think all the four of them were even insignificant. For high load, what we did is that, so this is the replication of the high load, so the target is embedded within the big object, and then one single distractor. So we made the distractor the same size as the distractor object, the same size as the target object. So trial after trial, it was not immediately clear to the participant which one was the relevant object. They were both the same size. And here we separated the letters. So again, so this is the replication, which means much slower reaction times than the replication of low load. Here is around, I don't know, the average around 450, let's say. And this, the high load replication was around 600, I don't know, 30. And look, the same size distractor was even more difficult, so higher load, so less resources should become available for processing the distractors, but we had a significant distractor interference. This is another manipulation in which this is a replication of the low load, and here again we had the fixed position relative to the target. Here we did the same for 3 letters, a medium load. And again, the replication of the low load was with a significant interference, and our fixed position was even lower load, much faster reaction times, but absolutely no interference. And the same opposite effects from the hypothesis of the perceptual load theory. All in all, so as you remember, the perceptual load theory predicts that the higher the load, that is, the more difficult the task, the less surpluses of resources remain after target identification, which should mean the less distractor interference. And the easier the task, the more surpluses, the more distractors are processed, the more they interfere. So our 3 replications replicated the perceptual load hypothesis prediction. But our other manipulations, which the perceptual load rationale should predict exactly this negative correlation. but we had a very strong positive correlation. So to finish, I want to present you two theoretical explanations to the perceptual load effects that are alternative to the perceptual load theory rationale. So as we said that the main, perhaps the biggest theoretical problem with the perceptual load theory is the idea that there is a minimum amount of processing resources that must be exhausted in a certain task or time. It's not clearly defined. And second effect, the methodological problem that the two conditions were presented in separate block of trials, which allow participants to engage in tactics that if so, the results may be confounded with those strategies. So the first alternative explanation, if you remember the feature integration theory by Anne Treisman, she has shown us that when we have to identify a target that is presented within many distractors and the target is very salient, in this case its orientation, that it pops out. We process the entire display at once and we immediately find the target. So it doesn't matter how many distractors are presented together with the target. Here we have accuracy. The performance remains the same. Here the target pops out because it has a different color. So you can add as many distractors, the performance target identification remains as efficient as irrespective of the number of distractors. And when you have a conjunctive search, meaning you have to find the target according to its color and its orientation, then the more distractors are presented in this together with the target, the harder it is to find the target. Okay, so this is a conjunctive search, and this is a parallel search, and this is a serial search. So this is the same idea. So here the target pops out. So the participants engage in a parallel search for the target. And here we have reaction time, and it doesn't matter how many distractors are presented together, the performance is equal. And when the participants have to engage in a serial search, more focused one by one to find the target, the more distractors, the more difficult it is, the longer it takes. So if you remember, the second most famous, prominent, used manipulation of the perceptual load effect is this display where the target, these are low loads, the target is embedded within this circle of distractors. In the low load, all the distractors are clearly discerned, are identical and clearly discerned from the target. And in the high load, the distractors are other letters. So what Tivis, Kramer, and Bolopovsky suggested is that in low load for these displays, these participants engage in a parallel search. So they look at the display and immediately the two salient objects pop out and they are both processed, and that's why in low load trials the distractor end up being processed. In the high load, the participants must engage in a serial search. They look one by one until they find the target, so they end up not processing the distractor. The second explanation, alternative explanation, is the dilution explanation by Hani Benoni and Yoshua Tzal. they suggested that when you have a lot of letters, the more letters are processed, the more representations enter, I don't know, we can use whatever, memory buffer, short-term memory, then the identity of each one of them is diluted because there are many. When there are only 2 letters processed, the proportional representation of each one of them is stronger. So in low load displays, where there is very little dilution, only 2 letters, 2 representations are processed, the representation of the distractor identity remains very strong. When there are 5 letters processed, the proportional representation of the distractor is diluted by 5 different letters. So the identity of the distractors is less present. So it interferes less. So what they did is a third condition in which the same high load display was presented, but now the target was salient by a different color. So here, the same number of letters were processed. So there was a high dilution, 5 letters were processed. But here, because the target was in a different color, the participants identified the target much faster. Here they used the same idea in the second, in a different manipulation, different display. So again, here we have low dilution, only these 2. And here we have still low dilution, but the target was different from the distractor. And here we have a high dilution, but low load, because it was easy to find the target, but high dilution. And what they found, indeed, that when there was low load and low dilution, there was a significant distractor interference, the difference between congruent and incongruent. Previously, I showed you the difference between neutral and incongruent. Here it is congruent and incongruent. It doesn't matter. This is considered the same. So this is a replication. But when the dilution was high, the reaction time, the mean reaction time was the same for these 2 conditions, but the distractor interference completely disappeared.